Riddle me this. What can take you from a state of nirvana to no longer having a good time? A lack of inspiration.
Okay, honestly, I don't even think that was a riddle. I guess I'm just not the influencer that Edward Nashton is. But boy oh boy do I want to talk about that new Batman movie. Matt Reeves' Gotham is meticulously planned out with a clear respect for a whole slew of 70s noir films. Let's check out exactly what inspired this detective story. A detective tale is really only as good as the culprit makes it, so a lot was riding on the Riddler for this one. We've seen a number of interpretations before, like Jim Carrey thinking he was cast as the Joker, and the Arkham Games version, which was actually pretty interesting, but it had us all slamming our heads trying to find all of those stupid trophies. It may not come as the biggest surprise that Matt Reeves and Paul Dano drew inspiration from the real world's most infamous puzzling murderer, the Zodiac Killer. Pretty much everything this version of Edward Nashton does was inspired by him. There's the most obvious connections like the cryptic ciphers that both killers used, the logos for both being extremely similar, and even their sign-on being the exact same. When speaking on the inspiration with the Zodiac, Matt Reeves stated, "I read this book Mindhunter, which was profiling all of these serial killers, and then of course I revisited the Zodiac story and I thought, gosh, when you look at the Zodiac who was leaving all of these ciphers and puzzles and taunting the police and the newspapers, that sounds like the Riddler." While very little is known about the appearance or the voice of the real Zodiac Killer, police dispatcher Nancy Slover took an anonymous call from the killer in 1969 and described his voice as weirdly musical, speaking in a drawn-out fashion.
He said something like, "Goodbye."
I don't know about you guys, but I've had Paul Dano going, "Bruce Wayne," stuck in my head for the last few days, and I think it's awesome that even his voice was inspired by the smallest tidbit of information we have on the killer. Upon first inspection, the 1970 Barracuda Batmobile is dinky compared to the literal tank we've seen in the Nolan movies, but man oh man did it lead to quite the impressive scene. Early on in the movie, we see the bat signal light up, terrifying all of the petty criminals around Gotham. While Batman using fear is definitely not a new concept for the caped crusader, the Batmobile inspiring immediate panic is somewhat new. To make a vehicle seem terrifying, the production team took to another classic terrifying vehicle, the Beetle known as Herbie. I'm kidding, they used Stephen King's classic Christine as inspiration for when we first see the car rev up. In describing the connection, Matt Reeves explained, "It has to make an appearance out of the shadows to intimidate." So I thought of it almost like Stephen King's Christine. I like the idea of the car itself as a horror figure, making an animalistic appearance to really scare the hell out of the people Batman's pursuing. I haven't been able to find anything to definitively confirm this connection, but the most badass shot of the movie happens after Oswald thinks he's bested the Bat.
I got you! I got you!
Only for the Batmobile to fly through a fiery explosion. This terrifying image of the car on fire reminds me a lot of that gas station scene in the Christine movie, which used an extremely similar effect. Since we know Christine was an inspiration, I would have to assume this was an intentional reference. When this movie was only in pre-production back in 2018, Matt Reeves said, "We're not doing any particular comic book. Year One is one of the many comic books that I love. We're definitely not doing Year One. It's just exciting to be focused very specifically on a tale that is defining for Bruce Wayne and very personal to him." So if Year One wasn't the main inspiration, what was? Well, as Matt said, nothing in particular. However, there is a whole slew of comics that served as influences to the film. The most obvious would be Batman Year Two, because this movie takes place in Year Two of the Caped Crusader's career. That storyline is actually pretty similar to the one in the film, with Batman and Jim Gordon working together to try and piece together a string of murders, except this one has the Riddler committing the crimes instead of the comic, which used the Reaper. Fans of The Long Halloween may have noticed a couple of nods to that run. Both works feature a novice Batman investigating mob crimes while surrounded by an entire cabaret of colorful villains like Catwoman, Falcone, the Riddler, and Joker. It's not the most definitive inspiration, but I love that we were able to receive a Batman film with a whole macabre of villains featured that didn't turn out like Batman and Robin.
A laundry service that delivers. Wow.
Batman Ego and Other Tales is another direct inspiration for the film. In that run, we see Batman pitted against Bruce Wayne, which had a direct influence to how Robert Pattinson played the duality between the two characters. Both this movie and that run feature a moody narration from the Batman, and both end similar, with Batman coming to the conclusion that he has to be both a symbol of hope for the citizens of Gotham, while still pressing fear into the criminals that threaten it. Before this movie came out, if you told me a fantastic interpretation of Bruce Wayne was influenced by Kurt Cobain, I would have thought you were crazier than the Mad Hatter.
What? No.
But here we are, and what a great inspiration it was at that. While Matt Reeves was writing the Batman, he had Nirvana playing in the background, which started to subconsciously influence some of the choices he made. Ultimately, the song Something in the Way was used as almost a theme song in the film, with both the marketing and movie prominently using it. The song fits perfectly, featuring the same moody tone the streets of Gotham have. However, Nirvana influenced the film even deeper than that. This movie kind of seemed like an origin story for Bruce Wayne, which was an element that we seldom see adapted in previous films. This was all totally intentional, with Gus Van Sant's Last Days being something that Matt Reeves wanted to inject in the movie. Last Days is loosely based on Kurt Cobain's Last Days, and there we see the musician being a recluse, suffering in his personal life in juxtaposition to the rock star he is meant to be, which ended up being the basis for Bruce's identity crisis here. While Gotham is in present day, the city streets all have a worn out feel to it. Almost like Gotham hasn't been touched from the 1970s, from its rundown architecture to all the little tidbits of set dressing like the outdated cars. This was intentional, as Matt Reeves religiously studied 1970s noir flicks while writing the script. He took the extremely flawed and intensely gritty tone of the French Connection and combined it with the corruption elements of Chinatown as a way of bringing in some new life to the Gotham PD. Now, how can a movie take inspiration from 70s crime classics and not take a few beats from The Godfather? Both Robert Pattinson and Colin Farrell incorporated elements from characters seen in that series to inform their roles. For Pattinson, he looked to Michael Corleone for inspiration. On paper, this might sound absolutely insane, and another absurd lie that R. Pats has told in an interview.
The first time I went to a circus, somebody died. One of the clowns died.
How did the clown die?
His little car exploded.
But Michael and Bruce are actually oddly similar. Both characters are a part of a dynasty that they're not terribly fond of, and are forced to navigate the world in the shadow of their great fathers. Colin Farrell, on the other hand, was influenced by Fredo.
I know it was you, Fredo.
Explaining the connection between the two characters, Matt Reeves was just talking about somebody who had very real and very lofty ambitions, but never really had the opportunity or chance to explore them, and was maybe looked upon as someone who was handicapped, whether it was psychologically, intellectually. Fredo was frowned upon as less than the other brothers, and maybe Oz as well. Alright, we aren't done with the 1970 film references just yet. I wasn't lying when I said Matt Reeves religiously studied this specific decade of crime film. This next reference comes with the relationship between the bat and the cat, and that movie is Clute. Reeves was struck by the incredible chemistry between Donald Sutherland and Jane Fonda, and was surprised at how much their relationship was similar to how he envisioned Bruce and Selina. In Clute, Donald Sutherland's John Clute was a very driven detective, driven to a fault. His worldview is extremely narrow, dealing with absolutes. Everything is either good or bad, with no in between. Then Jane Fonda's Bree Daniels enters the fold and entirely challenges that perspective. It's from here that both characters can learn from one another, creating one big happy ending where they both are able to change their worldviews for the better. If you've seen the movie, which I really hope you have at this point, I've been absolutely spoiling it, you would immediately understand exactly how this was interpreted in the film. As horrible as most of those Saw sequels turned out to be, I will always have a soft spot for the increasingly bizarre traps that John Kramer left behind. Seeing extremely elaborate contraptions like the angel trap was so f***ed up that I couldn't help but be fascinated. That's why when we started to see the increasingly obscure traps left behind by the Riddler, I just knew that Billy the Puppet was smiling somewhere with his little ventriloquist head. If you told me that a rat trap was a prop from the Saw films, I genuinely wouldn't blink an eye. The Riddler seems like a really weird villain to start off this grounded reality with, but the Saw references, all the way to Edward calling into his crimes, was just downright bone-chilling. And I'm not talking about the bone-chilling like the freezer in Saw 3. I mean, like, this is a kid's movie. Why is a man's head about to blow up? When that first Fandom trailer was released to the world, we were all shocked at how much this movie reminded us of Seven, which was entirely intentional. Everything about this detective story feels similar to David Fincher's masterpiece, from the relationship between the two lead detectives to the extraordinarily gruesome crime scenes and clues left behind. Heck, both killers even leave massive clues on the floor, and both have an affinity to using severed body parts. Thankfully, the Riddler only uses a thumb drive. It would be weird if we seen Gwyneth Paltrow's head just appear in this one. If you've watched Cosmopolis, it would be easy to mistake that it was Cronenberg's flick that inspired Reeves to cast Pattinson, but it was actually the Safdie brothers' Good Time that immediately inspired the casting. Matt Reeves explained, "He's got an inner kind of rage that connects with this character, and a dangerousness, and I could feel this desperation, and I became dead set on it being Rob." Matt's appreciation of Good Time is glaring throughout the film. Both feature a tense pace that makes it seem like the worst can happen at any given point. And there's even a fun reference to that film in here with a store in Gotham called Good Time Grocery. I feel like I also have to quickly mention the Dirty Harry connection with the opening of this movie.
Go ahead. Make my day.
Both films feature a Zodiac-inspired lunatic scoping out their first victim. It's a haunting revelation once you realize that it's not our heroes doing the surveillance work, setting the tone for the rest of the piece.